Hello, everyone joining us. We'll give it just a quick moment as everyone signs on to get started. We're so grateful to have you here today to talk about the case for inclusion. We'll just give it one more moment as everyone transitions onto the link. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We're here to talk about the national release of the Case for Inclusion 2024, Transforming Temporary Progress into Long-Term Sustainability. I'm going to walk us through a few housekeeping notes, and then I will hand it over to Armando to present our opening. So just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be shared with registrants within 3 business days, but you can also access the recording on caseforinclusion.org. Caseforinclusion.org has been updated with the report. It also has all of the data findings that are noted in the report, and you can look at those on a state-by-state basis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the data, but I'm so happy to have you here today, and you can access those things and the recording on the caseforinclusion.org. Today, we will have a short Q&A function, so please take a moment if you do have any questions at any time to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom control panel to ask questions of today's speakers. When we get to the end of our speakers, we will open up that Q&A and we'll go through those that have been submitted to the Q&A feature, so please take a moment to do that. You can also use the chat feature in the Zoom control panel to connect with any of us if you're experiencing technical difficulties. We're happy to hear from you, and we'll do our best to help you during the webinar or connect you with somebody who can. Closed captioning is available. If you click on the CC icon in the Zoom control panel, you can access that closed captioning. Just to walk us through today's agenda, I will just in a moment hand you over for opening remarks. Then we'll review some of the key findings data from the report. Then we're so fortunate to engage in a from the field panel discussion from professionals who are engaging in this work in the field. Then we'll walk us through our policy blueprint for sustainable services, have a short Q&A time, and then we'll hand you out for closing remarks. And with that, thank you so much. I'm handing you over to Armando to open us up.
Thank you, Lydia. Good afternoon and welcome. I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for joining us today. I'm Armando Contreras, President and CEO of United Cerebral Palsy. I'm joining you from our UCP headquarters in Vienna, just outside of Washington, D.C. I can see that several hundred people are attending this 2024 Case for Inclusion launch. So thank you all for signing on. This year, in collaboration with our affiliates across the country and Canada, United Cerebral Palsy is proud to mark its 75th anniversary. Founded in 1949 by Leonard Goldenson, then president of United Paramount Theaters and ABC Television, and his wife, Isabel, the couple joined with Jack and Ethel Hausman to improve the quality of life for children with cerebral palsy. The Goldensons and Hausmans placed an ad in the New York Herald Tribune to recruit others committed to improving services for children with cerebral palsy. They hope that this would keep families together and to ensure that people with disabilities can stay in their community. 75 years later, UCP has 55 affiliates, 53 in the US and 2 in Canada, serving an estimated 155,000 people with disabilities and their families. With that in mind, it's an honor to be with you and to continue this vital work today in collaboration with our friends and colleagues at ANCOR and the ANCOR Foundation. So now, on behalf of UCP and our partners at ANCOR Foundation, welcome to the formal release of our joint publication, the Annual Case for Inclusion Report, the most comprehensive national analysis of state-based services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and the caregivers who support them. Thank you to the authors of this year's report, ANCOR's Vice President of Government Affairs, Lydia Dawson, for her leadership on this project, as well as Vice President of Communications, Dr. Sean Luchtefeld, and UCP's Communication Coordinator, James Garcia, both of whom provided feedback, editing, and other support for this publication. And my sincere gratitude to ANCOR's president and CEO, Barbara Merle, for her unwavering leadership and commitment to advocacy for care workers and for direct support professionals, and for partnering with us at UCP on this vital report. Thank you as well to the Case for Inclusion Steering Committee of UCP and ANCOR member representatives for their time and commitment to this project over the past few months. Finally, a special thanks goes to everyone at UCP's affiliates and ANCOR membership organization for their life-changing programs they provide year-round for people with disabilities and their families. Ultimately, this report is about their work and the communities they serve. Among its many significant findings, this year's Case for Inclusion details how wait lists are growing and signs that access to home and community care base services could slump even further as federal pandemic relief funding expires and threatens to destabilize today's severe workforce crisis. Proposed federal rule changes introduced in the past year are heightening concerns. If enacted, they can trigger higher costs for community services providers, including hundreds of agencies affiliated with UCP and ANCOR. Of course, this week's looming deadline for Congress to finally pass a federal budget adds to the uncertainty. As Congress and the White House continue to meet, UCP and ANCOR urges Congress to do its job and send a bill for the president to sign as soon as possible. As we all know, the welfare and lives of millions of people depend on the support and services that organizations like ANCOR and UCP deliver every day, most of it paid by Medicaid. This year's report is titled, "The Case for Inclusion, Transforming Temporary Progress into Long-Term Sustainability." The title reflects the modest but tangible gains made due to the pandemic-era emergency funding over the past 3 years, in addition to the stark and looming reality that this extra financial support will end soon. What is not ending is the intense competition for low-wage workers in our economy and the persistent labor shortages faced by providers who try to hire direct support professionals. In a moment, you'll hear in detail from the author of this year's report about the state of the workforce and our organization's joint recommendations on how best to address our industry challenges. After that, we'll present a panel discussion with experts in the field, then close with some final thoughts by my esteemed colleague, ANCOR's president and CEO, Barbara Merle. Before introducing our first presenter, I want to leave you with these thoughts. Today's national labor shortage is real and stubbornly persistent, which much of it is tied to our aging workforce, a drop in birth rates, and a parallel drop in legal immigration. According to the US Labor Department, in February, we had 9.5 million job openings in the US, but only 6.5 million unemployed workers. In other words, if every unemployed person in the country found a job, we still have nearly 3 million job openings. As real as this overall worker shortage is, when it comes to the professionals who care for people living with the most complex disabilities, the situation is even more dire, even as job turnover rates hover at nearly 50%. At the same time, our nation's disability support professionals are overwhelmingly women and people of color, mainly Black and Latino. Though a growing share of these workers are immigrants, mainly from Mexico and Latin America, but also from around the world. I make this latter point about the demographic makeup of this workforce because historically it has a great deal to do with how poorly paid they are. Nevertheless, the people who work these jobs are not only caring, hardworking, and highly specialized, but also deserving of a just and livable wage, but equitable career advance opportunities and much greater respect for the skills and talent they bring to the field. Just as important, people with IDD who often live with most challenging disabilities should not have to wait years to receive quality support services. They should receive services from people who earn a livable wage and benefits that ensure stable career paths and stable long-term care for the people that they serve. It's critical that we address these issues today because the demand for this care is expected to grow over the next decade, requiring the creation of more than 1 million new jobs and fueling more than 9.3 million job openings in the care community between now and 2031. That's more new jobs and job openings than any other single occupation in the country. Talk about essential workers. I share these facts not to overwhelm or discourage anyone, but to inspire us to act and commit ourselves to the work we do going forward, because simply put, it falls to us in the close alliance with self-advocates to ensure the support and inclusivity of people with disabilities across our society. United, we can overcome the challenges we face today and those yet to come. Join me as we work together on behalf and with people with disabilities and the dedicated workers who work day in and day out to ensure they live as independently as possible. Thank you for listening and joining us. Please welcome my esteemed colleague, Lydia Dawson, ANCOR's Vice President and Government Relations.
Thank you so much, Armando. I'm going to take one quick moment to transition us back to the slides so we can begin reviewing the key findings data from this year's case for inclusion, transforming temporary progress into long-term sustainability. And we come to the Case for Inclusion 2024 off of the heels of our Case for Inclusion 2023, which really emphasized how the workforce crisis is impacting access to services and how those access to services impact community inclusion for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This year's State of the America's Direct Support Workforce Crisis really shows that the workforce crisis is still continuing to deeply impact access to services. So many of the key findings that we'll review today are colored by the fact that we have such an enormous crisis of staffing. It becomes very difficult to assess how well people accessing services are able to reach community integration when they're relying on high rates of vacancy and turnover in the direct support workforce. 95% of respondents to the workforce crisis survey indicated that they were still experiencing moderate to severe staffing shortages in the past year. Much of our report really looks at, with the ending of the public health emergency declaration for the COVID-19 pandemic and coming into the termination of COVID-19 relief funding, how has that impacted services? And are we seeing a return to higher numbers? Are we seeing people begin accessing their communities? But what we're finding in the workforce is that the workforce crisis continues to deeply impact services. 95% finding that they experienced moderate to severe staffing shortages in the past year. And in terms of access, that means 77% of respondents reported turning away new referrals in the past year to ongoing staffing shortages, that people are unable to find new providers because providers are not able to accommodate new people coming into services, but rather have stabilized at the workforce that they have, and without incoming workforce are really struggling to take new people into services. We're seeing that on the front end also of providers offering case management services that are experiencing difficulty connecting people with available services. 75% of case management providers indicating that difficulty to find available providers to connect people with new services. As we look at how people are assessing whether or not they can continue providing services at all, we found that 60% indicated that they were likely to pursue additional discontinuations of programs and services into the future. We come into this year's report quite concerned about the workforce crisis and looking at those policy solutions about how we can continue to build on the progress that we're seeing from temporary measures taken as part of the COVID-19 pandemic, relief funding packages, and regulatory flexibilities. So given how dire it looks for the workforce crisis, what is the temporary progress that we're seeing? We saw hourly wages for direct support professionals, or DSPs, increased from $13.61 in 2020 to $14.41 in 2021. This marks the second consecutive year of wage increases, made possible in part at least from those COVID-19 funding increases. For example, and we'll hear more in our policy blueprint part of the presentation, that the American Rescue Plan Act included a 10% FMAP increase for home and community-based services, and that every state, including the District of Columbia, put at least part of that funding into recruitment and retention benefits. But we will see the end of that funding and the deadline to spend those funds in March of 2025. So as we look back into 2020 and 2021, it shows a great progress that we're seeing those increases in wages, but also concerned that that increase is tied so specifically to funding that we will see terminate and have seen terminate throughout this last year with the end of the public health emergency declaration. And I'm always reminded by our incredible steering committee that while this does indicate progress, that we're seeing these increases in wages, and that this is the second consecutive year that we've seen this increase in wages, $14.41 in 2021 is still incredibly difficult to be competitive with entry-level industries, that providers, even at this increased wage, are still struggling to find workforce and are losing those opportunities for dedicated DSPs in entry-level positions in fast food, convenience stores, retail. And so even though we are seeing these increases, we still have so much further to go. And again, you'll see those in our policy recommendations and the policy blueprint. And you'll see that reflected in the vacancy rates. So even though we do have this higher wage, the vacancy rates for both full-time and part-time DSP positions increased substantially, with full-time vacancy rates increasing to 16.5% and part-time vacancy rates increasing to 20.3% in 2021. And compared to pre-pandemic in 2019, these rates have almost doubled, that the vacancy rates for both full-time and part-time have really tremendously increased, finding that even at these higher wages, we're really struggling to continue having a viable workforce to support people. And we saw that again in the workforce crisis survey that showed that people are continuing to consider discontinuations of services based on the inability to have sufficient staffing to continue those services. We did see also virtually no change in the turnover rate. Turnover rate remained at approximately 43%. It was 43.6% in 2020, 43.3% in 2021. And we're finding, as part of looking at the state of America's direct support workforce crisis, that there's really only so high of a turnover rate before providers start considering closures, that there's only so high of a vacancy rate before providers say that they can't continue to provide that service and meet the quality expectations for providing support in a home and community-based setting. So while we haven't seen an increase in the turnover rate, there may be that tipping point where that turnover rate has gotten so high that we won't see a higher turnover, we'll simply see more closures. Nationally, we also saw the wait list for people with IDD on state waiting lists for home and community-based services increase to almost 500,000. That's 497,354 people with IDD on state waiting lists. As we discussed in the 2023 report and again in the 2024 report, these numbers and seeing that those increases are always concerning and always indicative of an inability to connect people with services. However, it's not the only barrier that keeps people from accessing home and community-based services. Were we to see that number decline, it may not necessarily indicate that people have continued access to home and community-based services, because there's a number of other barriers, which we'll discuss a little bit further on, which really create obstacles in people being able to access community integration and support in their homes and communities. But quite concerning to see that number increase so much between the last year. We also see most of that increase, 80.5% of people with IDD waiting for home and community-based services living in just one of 5 states, primarily Texas, but Texas, South Carolina, Florida, Illinois, and North Carolina is still holding very high wait lists for home and community-based services. We also saw in the data this year as organizations continued to track the wait lists for home and community-based services, an interest in looking more into other ways that states may categorize people as not receiving home and community-based services. This was also a discussion in this year's and last year's report is how states categorize their wait lists, that states have differing criteria for what means that you can be on a state waiting list for home and community-based services. And some states have moved away from waiting lists to registries or referral lists that don't get counted on their official wait list. So this year we did see an interest from researchers in looking not just at state waiting lists, but also looking at the secondary category of referral lists or registry lists that may also indicate that people are not accessing home and community-based services. We also saw, in terms of positive impacts in the case for inclusion reports, we saw 17 states and DC close their public residential facilities. So those are those large state-run facilities housing 16 or more people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We also saw 38 states participate in the federal Money Follows the Person program. And that's the program that has funding earmarked to support the transition from institutions to HCBS. And this is also a really exciting thing to see in this year's report, because this represents an increase of states participating in Money Follows the Person after multiple years of modest declines in states willing to participate in this program. It's not altogether clear why we saw for such a long time states decrease in their participation of Money Follows the Person. It could be because the funding for Money Follows the Person is temporarily authorized, and so it can only be relied on for the years that it's appropriated for. But what we are seeing is more states interested in supporting that transition away from institutions and into home and community-based settings. But taking that against the problems that we're seeing in the field supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to truly access home and community-based services, it causes a little bit of a concern seeing these two figures against each other. This slide here against this real interest in moving people away from institutions, because we have to have an adequate network of providers, services, and supports to make sure that that transition is successful. Money Follows the Person provides funding that supports that transition, but once someone has reached the community, they need to be able to access the supports and services that they need to stay and thrive in the settings that they're at. And what we don't want to see is people coming out of institutions not receiving the support that they need, and then having to go through that process of coming back to an institution or coming back to a hospital, especially when we're seeing closures in those facilities themselves, leaving people really without a support network. So positive to see this interest in moving more to home and community-based settings, but also feeling that pressure of really needing to make sure that there's an adequate network there to support them. We also saw and began tracking in this year's report demonstration waivers that include initiatives to address social determinants of health that have been approved. So at the start of 2024, there were 18 demonstration waivers, that Section 1115 waivers, that included initiatives to address social determinants of health, and 17 more that were pending. And so what this suggests is that, again, even if you are able to make it off of a wait list for home and community-based services, you've accessed one of these programs to support the transition out of an institution and into a home and community-based services setting, being able to access those services also includes a number of social determinants of health and the availability of health-related social needs. So, for example, in order to receive support in your home, you you have to have a home to receive that support in. And so affordable, accessible housing has been an enormous barrier to people being able to adequately access support in their homes and be able to truly reach these goals of community inclusion and community integration. And so we're starting to see states really take opportunities that are available through demonstration waivers to start looking at initiatives that would address some of those social determinants of health, in addition to just access to services. Again, just looking at the report as a whole, so exciting to see this progress and how the federal funding that we're seeing in some of these federal initiatives really have an impact on wages and access to support. But as we reach the termination of those COVID-19 relief funding packages, as we reach the end of the public health emergency declaration, there remains an emergency in community-based settings in terms of being able to ensure that people can access the support that they need for community inclusion. And so as we transition out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we need sustainable policy solutions that will support us moving forward so that we can build on this progress and sustain the progress instead of reaching what appears to be a fiscal cliff for providers trying to support people in their homes and communities. So with that, it's always so important that we're hearing from professionals in the field, because the data, when we look at it from afar, really has the potential to paint a picture, but how it looks in the field and how that data actually plays out is so important in capturing the truth of whether or not people are receiving community inclusion in services and access across community-based settings. So with that, I would love to hand you over to James Garcia, who is going to moderate our panel, and I would ask that our panelists turn on their cameras. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. I really appreciate it. Terrific presentation, as always. And thank you again for all of the research and the guidance and leadership that you put into this project. It wouldn't happen without you, and it certainly wouldn't happen as well. It's a terrific report every year. So now to our panel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you the names of the panelists and their quick titles, and then ask them in sequence to individually provide a little bit of a description about their organization so that we have kind of a nutshell understanding of where they're coming from geographically, as well as the kind of work that their organization does. And then I'll go right into some questions. So to the panelists, if you could keep your descriptions about your organizations a little bit brief, then we'll be able to get to the questions as soon as possible. So our speakers today, or rather our panelists today, are Kente Garvin, who's the president and CEO of UCP of Central Arizona, one of the 55 affiliates that we have around the country and 2 in Arizona. Rachel Newman is the Chief Operating Officer at COF Training Services in Ottawa, Kansas. It's an organization that provides services for people with IDD throughout Kansas. She could talk specifically about that. And then Gray Persons at Hope House Foundation, a nonprofit that provides services to adults with developmental disabilities in the Norfolk, Virginia area. So let's start with Kente, if you don't mind, please talk briefly about your organization, and then we'll go to the other 2 speakers.
Sure. Kente Garvin with UCP of Central Arizona. We are a full health and human services organization. We have a clinic that provides therapy services for early detection all the way through the age of 13, preteen. We have an adult program that has a DTA program, and we also have HCBS services, primarily in HAB, respite, and attended care.
Rachel?
Hi, wonderful to be here. COF is a more specialized organization. We just provide home and community-based waiver services for individuals with IDD. I saw a lot of comments about rural areas and how the workforce crisis affects those. And we do operate in 3 rural counties. So we can definitely relate to that. And I'll speak to some of that as well today.
And congratulations on your football team. Also now Gray Persons, if you could briefly.
Thanks. Thank you, James. Yeah, I'm Gray Persons. I'm Advocacy and Outreach Coordinator for Hope House Foundation. Hope House provides support to 125 adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities exclusively in their own homes and apartments throughout southeastern Virginia, regardless of how complex their disabilities may be. I did want to mention that Hope House, in addition to being a provider, has always really worked at the forefront of advocacy and leadership of this field. Hope House was among the first in the nation to commit to exclusively supporting people individually in their own homes back in the 80s. And we've worked for decades to inspire other providers to join us by adopting our philosophy and model. And we've inspired a lot of people, but we haven't seen as much change as we'd hoped. And I think that that's because rates and regs create significant barriers, in many cases requiring providers to sacrifice revenues to transition models. And so I involved in a ton of advocacy about rates, policy, and regulation, and have used the case for inclusion quite a bit. So I really do appreciate this opportunity to be here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you for reading the Case for Inclusion. As we prepare for this every year, I run into people around the country who use it. And so I'm so glad that they do, because that's the goal, obviously. Let's begin, Kente, maybe circle back to you. This direct support workforce crisis that we speak about that is not getting any better. There was the minor improvements, if you will, because of the pandemic funding. Thank goodness for that. But talk about how the support, the direct support, professional and generally speaking, caregiving workforce crisis impacts what you guys do day to day.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality is that to provide service, you need service providers, right? And we're just experienced a complete shortage of it. I mean, there's really, bottom line is everything that's been talked about in this in the ANCOR report is just right on point. I mean, look, it's a workforce development issue. It's a payment issue, right? It's a recruitment of the workforce and the training of the workforce, right, are at the heart of what the overall issues are. And if you think about it too, it's a couple things, right? Armando outlined, I think eloquently earlier about the challenges to the workforce, but then you take on top of that the type of individual needed to perform this type of job, right? So we're talking about a different subset of the workforce in general, right? Because you're talking about a compassionate individual that's actually turned to this type of work. What we're seeing primarily is a lot of our ACBS care is being provided by families of the individuals. And the challenge is recruiting that workforce outside of that family space to be able to enhance those programs and services. Right? Because the same individual that will come in and do this workforce, the same individual that comes into this workforce is not necessarily the same individual that would apply to Starbucks or some of these other areas. But at the same time, right, even if that individual was inclined to come into this space, with the wages being lower than the competitive wages into some other areas, it makes recruiting even more difficult.
Rachel, could you address the same question and perhaps provide some insight into maybe innovative ways that you're trying to overcome the challenges that Kente just articulated?
Yeah, absolutely. So Kente, you opened this up great. You highlighted some really important stuff. It is a person that requires specialists in so many different areas and expertise to be able to be a really good DSP. And beyond the fact that we're already working with a subset, those specific subset of people are being heavily recruited from other areas. So I like to say that we were in a workforce crisis way before that was the cool thing to be in. And so everyone started talking about this during the pandemic, but we've been working on this for years and years. So we've partnered with some great agencies to really try to address recruitment and retention of employees, trying to highlight the benefits that we can provide outside of financial incentive. But benefits don't put bread on the table. So we have to continue to address the financial piece, but things like good EAP programs, good services and support for your staff. We recently hired a an employee success coach, and her sole job is to help employees feel successful, to give them and meet them where they're at, to provide whatever support they need. So she might help them set up EAP appointments if they're struggling at work or they're overwhelmed with the trauma of losing someone they care about, or they have really big goals and she's helping them look at their finances to say, how can we make these goals work? Do you want to go back to school and hold a job? How can we make that work? Kente, you also talked about families meeting needs. I am the primary caregiver of my sister with autism, who is on our 11+ year waiting list in Kansas. So I'm trying to balance that and be a professional working in the field. And so we see that the people that we are employing are also personal caregivers. So we're trying to meet them at that too. How can we provide you flexible scheduling so that you can take care of your sister, grandma, child with disabilities and also work with us? So it's our biggest success, I think, is knowing the DSP and treating them with the same level of person-centered care that we treat our individuals with. We need to know who you are, what you need, and how we can support you to be successful. And those people are our biggest recruiters, the ones that say, these people care about who I am and they care about the work that I do. So I definitely think that's huge, but we've lost some of those great people too, because they're being recruited for places where they can do a lot less for a lot more money, or just basically they need more to make their needs meet. So we've got to find a way to keep those people. We're still working on it, but money talks, obviously. So appreciate the introduction to this great discussion.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And of course, the recent issues we've had with inflation affect everything that you just spoke about. A quick note, my wife and I care for my mother-in-law who is MS and has had it for 45 years. So we live with that kind of day-to-day issue as well. And then by coincidence, I didn't have anything to do with this. My two nieces who we raised both work as caregivers now at an adult center. And so I hear from them when they come home for dinner or come by for dinner, all of these issues, right, firsthand from their perspective of the people that are trying to do that job. Great. If you could speak to that question, but also in the context, I think you were suggesting that maybe the effort to provide more independence, close down larger institutions, have more states be on that list of states that don't have large institutions, is being hampered. That's being sort of slowed by the issues that we're having today. Is that correct? And if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I can speak very specifically to what's going on here in Virginia, where
Sure.
We have a settlement agreement that's been in place with the Department of Justice, where we're not yet in compliance. You know, when you're trying to keep the train on the tracks, it's real hard to be extremely innovative. And so I would say that, you know, the state has been working through compliance with the Department of Justice settlement agreement, which has driven a ton of regulation and a lot of oversight. And so a lot more of that side of the work then you have the pandemic come in. And now all of a sudden you have folks that, look, this is a job. This is 100% people. It's people leading and supporting people to support people, 100%, right? And so culture is so stinking important in this. People have to believe in the work they're doing, because if you're doing this work for a paycheck, then you're probably going to be doing other work. With the pandemic, even those people that were believers, right? Some of our best people who went into dire straits, their own families, kids at home, having to do a lot of different things. And we saw a tremendous amount of turnover. And it's just kind of threw things into chaos for a number of years. And so, when we have this situation where, all right, now we're trying to stabilize the workforce, we have seen some increases in reimbursements. I will say that thankfully at Hope House Foundation, we have stabilized our workforce. They're not a workforce with the same level of experience that we've had in the past. So, you know, now you have to build that up. But when we talk more broadly about systems, it's just very hard to inspire and innovate and have providers enter new supports when they're struggling to provide the supports that they're offering right now. So I think that's probably something that everybody sees.
Yeah, yeah. And we're talking in the report, we're talking in terms of the things that ANCOR and UCP are supporting in terms of getting Congress to try to provide more funding, especially if they're going to be raising the salary caps for staff. And you're talking obviously about the struggles of keeping workers. Where do volunteers come into the mix? I mean, my wife and I volunteer to take care of my mother-in-law, but in terms of what you guys do at your facilities, how much does that factor in? Those people who are out there just helping and not getting paid, how much does that help? Kente?
So I was struggling with my mute button here. We are actively recruiting volunteers to help participate in some levels, but for us, it's not as as a kind of a big boost overall to our support levels that we use, right? The reality is that we're anchored a lot, right, by what the reimbursement rates are, right? So at the end of the day, we're not for profit, right, which is a tax designation, but we're still a business, right? And so you can't pay out more than you bring in, right? So we have the opportunity to supplement where we can, with some outside donations, right? But the amount of pay for DCWs is just too low, right? It's too low relative to the type of work that they're doing. And as the other two folks here have just pointed out, right, is that the competitive jobs in the market are just paying more. So even if you have a calling that pulls you into this space, right, you still that calling would have to supersede your desire to not be part of the working poor, right? And so what we're seeing is a lot of folks who, even if they do have that calling, are still going to other areas. That's why, again, I say our main challenge is where we do have families that are providing the services for their own family. It's actually building up that workforce outside of the family members that can go in there and provide, the respite services, some ongoing HAB services. What if, the expectation, Rachel was mentioning, part of the wraparound services that you have for their direct care workers, making sure that you can allow them to do some time there and then work there and then work another job, right? But that's we don't really have that in our population as much, and that's a struggle, right? To be able to work a full-time job and to also to be able to put in the amount of hours necessary to provide the appropriate care for that family member. So again, I think the primary challenge is reimbursements for the services provided, and then what that allows us to do with respect to what we call it is covering the gap in care, right? The gap in care loss, and that's what we talk to our donors about, right? Is what are the outside contributions that we need to cover that space between what the state reimburses us for and what all the other things that we have to do to hire, retain, and employ that workforce, right? Because this workforce also has different requirements on it, right? Background checks, fingerprints, drug tests, things like that aren't required in some of the other competing jobs. So we're just watching that dwindle away as we continue to struggle and try to bring people to this area.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Rachel or Gray, unless there's anything you can add with regards to depending on volunteers, would you mind speaking to advocacy in terms of what your organizations do? I think you alluded to this earlier, Gray. If you could speak to that briefly, and then I'll go to Rachel. Advocating for these things, how do you do that at the ground level?
Well, the first thing that we do is we involve people that we support. So I advise Our Voices, which is a self-advocacy group made up of folks. It's led by people that we support, and its membership is made up of people we support. So it's really their voices and their stories and their experience. My voice and what I have to say doesn't mean a whole lot to people, but what people that we support have to say means a ton. And so working alongside people that we support, we actively seek out and engage in partnerships. So the ARC of Virginia is a strong partner for us. General Assembly is happening right now. And so Our Voices are active in the ARC Self-Advocacy Alliance and their leadership. I mean, advocacy really is central to what we're doing, because I see what we do as being kind of example A of what can happen if you really if you really work hard towards inclusion of all people, including people with developmental disabilities. And so getting that story out there and demonstrating that to people is really central to what it is that we do.
Rachel, can you add to that?
Absolutely. So on the volunteer end, I want to also highlight that regulatory boundaries are there. Volunteers are very much a supplement for the fun things and the little things, but they can't replace qualified care. That takes background checks and all of the training and expertise. So they come in and they help us paint, or they help us clean up a room, or things like that. But to really meet the needs, we need actual workers. On the advocacy piece, that's huge. Gray, you hit it on the spot. Individuals served, and I want to highlight direct support workers, inform them of our funding system. We've lost so many DSPs who think, you guys are making all this money and you're not paying me anything, I can't do this work anymore. But once we started educating them on, look, our rates are set by the state, here's how the funding works, and you can help us. And we brought DSPs to the Capitol to advocate with us. One, the legislators care way more about their voice than about the high-level professionals that are working. And same goes to the individuals served. I worked on some legislation for 5 years, and finally I brought my sister with me to testify, and it was regarding employment for individuals with me. And I'm an informed person when employment for individuals with disabilities. And I'm a very informed person when it is in regard to employment with individuals with disabilities, but nothing replaced lived experience. And when my sister stood up in front of legislators and said how much she values cleaning the bathrooms because she gets a paycheck and she contributes to her society, they saw so much more impact than anything I could have said. So I think really engaging them, making sure that they understand and have access, and giving them a voice, both individuals and direct care level, is really where your advocacy power is.
Okay, and then we'll close with just a reminder that ANCOR, of course, provides tremendous resources. We're a member of ANCOR. We do the policy and advocacy work that we can do, but certainly our partnership with them is an incredible boon to everything we do, because they have people right there on the ground in DC speaking into the ears of people who create legislation. And so doing that at the local level and the federal level is incredibly important. We're going to go now. We're going to close out this part of it, and I'm going to hand it off to Elise Aguilar, who is the Director of Federal Relations for ANCOR, and she's going to be speaking about the recommendations that we have in this year's report.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James. Thank you to this amazing panel. It was such a pleasure just to even be here and be part of this. So thank you for the opportunity to really sort of tie together all of the pieces that we have been speaking about. How do we take those findings from this report and all of the great work that you all are doing, the advocacy pieces that you all are putting into place? How do we bring these things together, and what are our policy recommendations at the federal and state levels? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Of course, if you want more in-depth on all of these policy recommendations, I encourage you to check them out in the report itself. I'll do my best to sort of highlight some of just the top lines here, but we're always happy to continue engaging on these things. So yes, let's begin. We're sort of categorizing all of our recommendations into at the federal level, breaking down between recommendations we're making to the administration, so to the executive branch, versus to Congress, and then we're going to talk about at the state and local levels as well. So we're going to start with, what recommendations do we have to the Biden administration on how they can help sustain our services? And so you'll hear a lot of similar themes from our recommendations, both at the federal and state levels, as well as from the administrative side and the congressional side. And we always keep coming back to really, what, and this is something we just talked about on the panel, what is really that mechanism that's going to help sustain our services the best? And that's ensuring that we have adequate reimbursement rates. Really, so many of the systemic issues leading to turnover, vacancy rates, workforce shortages really come back to the reimbursement rate piece and to adequately funding our services. So the first recommendation is the administration administration can require states to establish systems of access monitoring to compel those regular reviews of Medicaid reimbursement rates. We also, of course, are consistently advocating for the different agencies within the administration to collaborate and coordinate with one another. And so in particular, we are really active in trying to encourage the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, to ensure that it's working alongside the Department of Labor and other agencies that really have an impact on our services. Really, it's that nexus between HHS, Medicaid, and labor issues where we often find ourselves. Really, our advocacy sort of lies in that place a lot. And so we are continuing to advocate that those agencies work together, and that the results of that advocacy will be that they are directing appropriate funding for community providers. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I didn't know if James was trying to break in. So that they are directing the appropriate funding and mechanisms in place prior to any significant increases or expenses in service delivery. Certainly, we've seen a lot of rulemaking from this administration, and we are really active to ensure that they are taking a really concentrated look at Medicaid-funded providers and how they can ensure these regulations don't have any negative impacts on our services. Next slide. Great. We also recommend that the administration requires states and federal agencies to collect and report on measures related to the direct support workforce. Those include measures that look at the volume, stability, and compensation of the direct support workforce, as well as measures that really address systemic barriers to equity, support for underserved communities, and the delivery of culturally competent services. So really trying to ensure we have accurate data around not only the workforce, but the individuals who are being served. And finally, we're asking the Biden administration to examine existing programs that support health-related social needs for people with IDD and the direct support workforce to better ensure access to healthcare and promote economic independence. Lydia spoke a lot about this within the findings section. And so, advance the next slide, please. Great. So shifting gears a little bit into the 118th Congress, that's the Congress we're currently in. We are in the second year of this Congress, and while you might see a really efforts by members of Congress to sort of try to wrap up legislative business before the end of this term, and especially as members are looking forward to elections and ensuring that they can continue to serve in Congress, it does feel a little bit like a clock that is winding down a little bit and ticking down, but please rest assured there is still plenty of time to advocate for positive legislative changes that will help support our services. And really top of that list is really just continuing to advocate for Congress to enact legislation to significantly increase the federal share of Medicaid funding for home and community-based services and stabilize the direct support workforce. So really measures that would provide increased funding specifically to help support the workforce, as well as, again, utilizing that as a mechanism to require states to regularly review Medicaid reimbursement rates. We saw this as a really big focal point of this administration, the Biden administration, when they took office. And then in last Congress, in the 117th, there was a really big piece of legislation moving through the Build Back Better Act. You might remember it being called, that would have done just that. Unfortunately, it didn't get passed in that Congress, but it doesn't mean that we are not continuing to advocate for that in this Congress and into the next as well. Another piece that we talked about a lot on this panel was utilizing and really harnessing all of the good things that have happened due to the American Rescue Plan Act. So those ARPA dollars that went out to every single state in DC who have utilized those funds to really invest in the workforce and invest in HCBS. We are asking Congress to pick up on that and ensure that that funding continues. While the ARPA dollars are set to expire next year, we're saying to Congress, look at what a federal investment can do in these services. It's time to ensure that this investment continues and authorize additional funding similar to those ARPA funds. And then also another big policy priority is asking the Office of Management and Budget to establish a standard occupational classification for direct support professionals. This would really allow for a comprehensive mechanism to collect accurate data on the direct support professional workforce that simply does not exist currently. It's really, really important that we have a mechanism to be able to collect that data. It is utilized by states across the country in terms of just looking at what their workforces look like at the state and local levels, helping with rate setting, ensuring that DSP wages are reflective of what that standard is. It's a really, really important policy piece, and we continue to push for that in Congress. And then our other recommendations are similar to those other pieces that we talked about around increasing funding through Medicaid funding and increased FMAPs for states. But we also do support grant programs and grant funding that would help support the training, recruitment, and retention of the direct support workforce. And finally, we also are currently examining existing policies that would expand opportunities to provide immigrants living in the United States with work authorizations, or create pathways for aspiring Americans interested in joining the direct support workforce. So we're really taking a look at what those policies are and how we can expand upon those opportunities to ensure we have a much stronger pipeline of direct support professionals, a direct support workforce moving forward. And now moving to the state level. So those are the federal policy recommendations. At the state level, we are recommending that states support and leverage as many opportunities as possible to secure additional funding from the federal government to, again, strengthen the direct support workforce, while also considering policies that would expand access to services. And again, we are recommending to states that they establish systems that provide regular review of Medicaid reimbursement rates. We also really, really strongly urge states to participate in the National Core Indicators Annual State of the Workforce Survey. That's really important to that data collection around what the direct support workforce looks like. While we don't have a comprehensive mechanism like we talked about and we advocate for the federal standard occupational classification, the NCI annual survey is a really great tool to take a really a much better look at what the DSP workforce looks like. And then also urging states to collect and publicly report on measures related to the direct support workforce. Again, we mentioned this in the federal policy recommendations, but asking states also to collect that data, looking at the workforce in terms of the volume, stability, and compensation, as well as, again, looking at those other measures that address systemic barriers to equity, supporting underserved communities, and helping to ensure the delivery of culturally competent services. And finally, we've laid out all of these policy recommendations. You've heard such great answers from Rachel and Gray and the entire panel on how we can really help advocate for ourselves at the federal and state levels. But again, what should you do? What are your takeaways? How can you take action? So you can visit the Case for Inclusion website, caseforinclusion.org, to access stories, data, and other resources. Really provides a way to take a much deeper dive into the data that's in the key findings report, and you can sort all of that data by state, by issue, and really dig in there. You can visit ANCOR's page, our amplifier, at amplifier.anchor.org. That's a great place to find our action alerts and other resources you can use to take action, and tell your members of Congress to support things like the standard occupational classification for DSPs. And of course, also please connect with the UCP affiliate in your community at ucp.org and see how you can get involved at the local level. So I think that's it for my part.
Thank you so much, Elise. With that, we do have time for a short Q&A, and I believe there's some Q&A in the Q&A function of the Zoom panel. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and would invite James as our moderator to come back and give us a couple from the Q&A section that we can offer from any of our speakers or from the panel, anyone joining us here today.
Okay, well, the panel did such a great job that they actually answered some of the questions, but I do want to go back to the question about rural settings. All of these data points, are they magnified in rural settings? Who would like to take that on? Rachel, perhaps, or?
Yeah, I'll take it because we operate in rural settings. So I think yes, very much so. When we're talking about some of the struggles to integrate and push for inclusion, I think those are absolutely magnified in rural settings. Housing and transportation are huge ones. And then just overall, the impact of one negative voice in a rural setting. So housing, for example, we had a community landlord who rented to multiple individuals we served. There was unfortunately an accident where one of the staff fell and there was a work comp case. Our work comp insurance, against our judgment, when we said do not do this, sued the landlord, and we had no choice because they're representing their interests, not ours. So we hired outside parties, all the things to try to fight it. They proceeded to sue the landlord. That landlord went to the local landlord association and said, hey, by the way, if you're renting to anyone with disabilities who gets services, you're going to get sued for any work comp claim. And none of the landlords in our local rural community want to rent to us anymore. And so there's these huge implications of one negative voice when you're trying to access resources. And then also accessing employees. I mean, it's just in rural communities, there's less employees to pull from. And our rural communities are very industrial. We have a nuclear power plant and a lot of industrial workshops like Walmart that start out at $25 an hour. So when they're looking for a rural-based job, this is unfortunately a hard one to recruit.
And distance, obviously, just the geographic distance is an obvious barrier, but did the move to Zoom and other streaming services like that, has that helped matters? And are you continuing to use that?
So I think that it helps matters in the access and connection with professionals like you, wonderful people. We are more connected and we get to learn more and get more ideas from many different people. I mentioned Blitz Media in the chat. They're out of another state, but they helped us a lot with our recruitment and retention efforts. So that access is helpful. In regard to providing the service, those flexibilities went away during COVID. So we are working with the state right now, doing some heavy advocacy to try to keep some of those, because they were very beneficial for individuals who live, 30 minutes away from our local sites in a very rural farm road community. But we have to get our state legislators and our state regulators on board with maintaining that flexibility long term.
Okay, Greg, could you also speak to that, please?
Which part of the question?
I'm sorry, particularly how these data points apply to rural areas. Yeah.
Well, we're really not in a rural area, so I'm probably not the best to speak to it.
James,
I will say though that some colleagues through my work at the ARC who are in rural areas, everything that Rachel just said. However, one area that does a little bit better is the wage in rural areas tends to be a little bit more competitive than, say, Northern Virginia, where that same reimbursement doesn't go as far. But
okay. Lydia, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, no, I thank you so much for the opportunity. I just wanted to share that we really do see all of these data points magnified in rural settings, particularly as we start to see providers close services and unable to take on new referrals and case management, seeking to try to connect new referrals with available providers. When you're in a rural area, there tends to be fewer providers available to provide choice of provider. And as those providers stop accepting referrals and start closing services, we are seeing the emergence of desert areas as people try to access community-based services. And when the focus of the service is to provide community inclusion and integration, and you're having to travel hours outside of your community to access those services, it really questions the underlying purpose of the program to connect you with your community. So it's quite a concern for rural areas.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. One of the primary issues, right, when we think about it is providing services that are both regionally and culturally appropriate, right? And so when you start, getting 30, 40, 50 miles away, in Arizona, we have, a large urban area, but we have a vast rural area as well, right? And so getting the workforce from one county to the next Again, it hits on a couple of issues, or all cross-section there, right? First is the culturally and regionally appropriateness of the services provided. People from the community, we find those are better accepted, right, than bringing some people from outside the community. And then the other issue is just the reimbursement, right? I mean, transportation and gas costs to go, 40, 50 miles away versus, a few blocks away just completely changes the, the ROI and the cost structure, especially when you're already talking about razor thin margins. So there's a lot of pieces adding to that complexity. But again, the root of it all is the reimbursement rates relative to the cost of providing the services is kind of a big component there.
Before I
Can I
ask the
jump
next
in real
question,
quick?
Lydia, I'm sorry, go ahead, Greg. Go ahead, Greg.
The one component, and this might be a different webinar, but one component that's outside of services is affordable housing. And in Virginia, there have been set-aside units that developers of affordable housing are integrating into affordable housing developments. And those are much more likely to occur in more populous regions versus rural regions. And so there is a severe shortage of those set-aside integrated units in more rural areas, which, that's part of the equation. You got to have a place to live, and then you have to have the supports. And so if you can't have the place to live, then you have to go someplace else.
Yeah. I think the housing issue is part of every webinar, it seems like these days. Yeah. Lydia, just very quickly, are we going to 15 after or 10 after? I just want to double check the time here before I ask the next question.
I think we have just about 2 more minutes for questions if there's another question that you can have for us, and then we'll close out.
Okay, so let me pose this last question. A question of inclusivity. Obviously, everyone here is working towards the inclusivity of people with disabilities and making sure that they are treated equitably, et cetera, et cetera. What other barriers with regards to inclusivity pop up in terms of what you're trying to do day to day? Just very briefly, since we have 2 minutes. If you could speak to that first, Kente.
Caught me off guard here. I had to get to my unmute button again. So what was the question? How barriers?
Well, just in terms of, I mean, we speak broadly on the issue of inclusivity of people with disabilities into integrated communities. What other issues with regards to questions of inclusivity are come up day to day with regards to the populations that you serve?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm really understanding the question, so let me make sure that I repeat it back out to you. Are you asking me what challenges people with disabilities face accessing services in our community?
Well, I guess that too, but also one of the things, as you guys were talking just a moment ago, I was thinking about Phoenix, for instance, is an area that is about 45 miles across from end to end. So clearly transportation is an issue in addition to whatever happens in the rural area, but also communities of color are located in sometimes far off places in an area like a metro area like ours. Is it difficult for them to get to your facility?
Well, yeah, that's that's one of the main problems we face here is trying to make sure that we have enough centers and service areas and therapy clinics in areas where people can access them, right? And again, this is kind of part and parcel of the rural issue as well, right? Because one of the things you want to make sure is that people in certain areas receive services that are culturally and regionally appropriate. Right. And so when you get into poor areas, right, you have other issues associated with it. All the issues that we're talking about are amplified, right? Because we're basically disability cuts across all socioeconomic levels, right? But we do know that certain things are felt in disproportionate impact depending on where you are within that socioeconomic level, right? So transportation and housing, how they impact people in the rural areas also impact people on the poor areas, right? And in your poor areas, you tend to have more in certain areas, Black and brown people. Not necessarily the case in the Arizona market as well, though, because, just the population distribution is a little bit different than what you might get in a New York area, right? But I would say the challenge is that poor people face broadly in accessing care, right, are doubly impacted when we talk about social services, right?
Yeah, you raised that point about income. If you're poor and you need to get somewhere, not having a car, having to take a bus for an hour and a half, worried about whether or not your housing is more temporary than someone else's, et cetera, et cetera. All
And it
factors.
has a ripple effect on down the spectrum, right? Because that also means you have a higher level of cancellations for services, right? Which also impacts the provision of services as well, right? Because
Okay.
there's times in certain communities where you need to double and triple book, right? Because you got to accept at least like a 15 to 20% cancellation rate when you're dealing with certain populations. And the root of those, again, come down to the impact of just being poor, right? Transportation, family member working, how do I get my kids? So we also provide therapy clinics. So we have a problem there, right? Whereas you have working family, clinics are open within only a certain hour. How do you get time to get off work and drop your kids off for a clinic? So just the problems with accessing care. And we talked a little bit, we can go on forever about this, right? We talked a little bit about social determinants of health and some other things as well. That's all amplified as you move social down, further down the socioeconomic level.
Sure. Okay, I'm afraid it looks like we have to close out, and I'm passing it back to Lydia, and she's going to close it for us, or
Thank
send
you
it to
so
our
much.
final speaker, I should say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you to all of our panelists. We really appreciate your insight. There are a couple of other questions in the Q&A, and I would offer that so many of those answers can be found at caseforinclusion.org and in the key findings report. So I'd hand you over to Barbara now to give us concluding thoughts, and just so much appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, everyone. Our panelists. What a terrific discussion. Just thank you so much. Thank you, Kente. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Gray. And just a great big huge thank you to you, Armando and James, and all of UCP for this partnership in publishing this report. It's just such an honor to be able to work with you in producing a report of this magnitude and importance. And then I just want to give a quick but heartfelt thank you to ANCOR staff, to Lydia Dawson and Sean Lichtefeld and Elise Aguilar for everything that you have done to make this report possible. I just also want to add that this report couldn't be possible without the valuable information that's tracked and published by numerous other organizations. We include that in the endnotes in the report, but we cite numerous reports that the federal government, the CMS, puts out. Kaiser Family Foundation, the National Core Indicators, the state of the workforce, formerly known as the Staff Stability Report, the University of Minnesota RISP report, that stands for Residential Information Systems Project. All of those data sources, most of them actually funded by the federal government, are just critically invaluable for pulling together the information in this report. As we say in the recommendations, we need a lot more data really specific to the workforce, and we get into those, but we'd be remiss in not thanking the current data sources because they really make a difference for advocacy. So this is not a report that belongs on the shelf, on the bookshelf, the virtual bookshelf, the actual bookshelf. This is a report to use. This is a report to share frequently. And, what is it? The early and often, take that old adage, share this early and often. Share it with all of your networks. Share it with self-advocates, share it with self-advocacy organizations, share it with family members, share it with friends, share it with community partners, share it with state officials, and share it with your state legislators. Share it with your members of Congress. No secret, this is a great big election year coming our way. Share it with candidates for Congress. Share it with your current United States senators, and share it with your current representatives to Congress. Share it with the members of the media. In other words, just share this thing. The really good news is we're going to be updating this report a lot sooner than a year from now. Our path forward now is not to just publish one case for inclusion annually, but we are going to start releasing periodic data snapshots that will help your advocacy as you go along, and it will allow us to be able to share some of these really important data sources as soon as they come out or shortly after they come out. So that's just really important. But then let me just kind of wrap up and say that every single gain that we have made as a community to improve the lives of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities has been through the power of advocacy. That's plain and simple. And that, that's you. That's all of us. We have this report. I think it's a pretty powerful report. It's got really critically important recommendations. Now let's together unleash its power. So that's it for this launch. Go forth and advocate, and thank you so much for joining us today.